So about a month ago, I did a video on sermon length, and I asked the question, how long should a sermon be? And when I did that video, I went off of a little bit of the research that had been done in the past on that, and also I had asked you to tell me how long you preach, and I kind of gathered that along with my own experience and an opinion that I hold to about sermon length, and I shared. You can check that out. Well, since that video has been released, Pew Research Center did a massive study of sermon length. If you don't know about it, you got to check it out. It's this article right here from Pew Research, The Digital Pulpit, a nationwide analysis of online sermons. So what they did is they actually analyzed 50,000 different sermons across about 6,000 churches. So what they did is they actually looked at 38,000 churches. Of those 38,000 churches, 6,000 of them had sermons available online. And of those 6,000 churches, they looked at 50,000 total sermons. So looking at multiple sermons per church, 6,000 churches, massive study. And they gathered a bunch of data, one of which, and what's getting perhaps the most attention, is how long are these people preaching? Now, there's more to this study than length, and I may get into this in later videos, but there's definitely more to this story than just sermon length, and we might get into that a little bit here. They got into kind of what was referenced in different sermons based on denomination and background and affiliation. But what's getting the most attention is sermon length, which is why I want to do this video as somewhat of a follow-up to the video that I did to get some hard data on how long different denominations actually preach. And then we'll talk about why this is important at the end. This is the original document, the digital pulpit. This is from Pew Research. I'm going to link to this in the YouTube description below. You can read it. I read it. It's very lengthy. It's really great. It goes into a lot of detail. Then there's actually a follow-up also by Pew Research, the Q&A, why we studied American sermons and how we did it. And you can read the Q&A about all that they learned from this process. But I want to look at three different sources that will kind of give us an idea of how people are thinking about this. And I like to look at this. I like to look at unreligious sources, like secular sources. We're going to look at the Washington Post. We're going to look at the New York Times, and then we're also going to look at the Gospel Coalition to see something they say about it. Let's start with the Washington Post. Does your pastor preach too long? That's just kind of interesting when you've got the Washington Post talking about sermons and church. Anytime the church and anytime preaching and sermons kind of makes it into the broader conversation of the culture and what they're doing, I just find it interesting. And I think you should find this interesting too. At least I want to pay attention to what they're saying, the questions they're asking, why they're asking those questions. This makes us better at what we do. It makes us better to know, how does a unreligious publication, a non-religious publication like the Washington Post, think about churches and think about religion and think about sermons? What kind of questions do they ask? What are they thinking? That's really helpful for us to know. So they ask, does your pastor preach too long? A new survey shows the dramatic differences in sermons. So one of America's most famous sermons, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, you probably know of this sermon, probably took Jonathan Edwards close to an hour to deliver in 1741. Today, most white Protestant pastors wouldn't dare keep people in the pews that long. In a new report released Monday, the Pew Research Center analyzed nearly 50,000 sermons, like I said, posted by 6,431 churches this year to find out how long Christian clergy preach and the words they use that distinguish them from one another. This is where it gets interesting to me. The sermon length is an interesting part of this, but the words that different denomination uses and different backgrounds use is a really interesting indicator. I don't know that anyone's ever done this in-depth of a study. Pew analyzed audio, video, and word count of sermons to estimate the length of sermons in different denominations. The average length of a sermon, researchers found, is 37 minutes, but there are striking differences across traditions. Now, before we get into breaking down the differences, I just think this is interesting that across the board, the average is 37 minutes. And in my video that I did called How Long Should a Sermon Be, one of the things I mentioned was that I, for a long time, forced myself to do a 30-minute sermon on the dot. And I did that for years. And in the last couple years, I've loosened that up and I do 35 to 40 with an average probably at that 37-minute mark. I just think that's interesting. Not that doesn't mean that's the best time. The average doesn't mean it's the best. It just means that of all the sermons out there from all the different denominations, 37 minutes is the average. And that's where I happen to land. And I feel like it's kind of a sweet spot, at least in my tradition. Now, for you, it might be different based on the type of church that you're in. Clearly, we're going to see that the length of sermon times varies. So across traditions, we got 14 minutes for Catholics. Here's something interesting. I got an email just the other day, and he is a Catholic priest, and he said, in most Catholic churches, he's looking at a 6 to 9 minute homily or a 6 to 9 minute sermon, which is interesting because the average is 14 minutes. So even within the denomination, you've got 14 minutes as the average, and you got some that come in at maybe half of that, and maybe some that come in at way more. 25 minutes for mainline Protestants. Okay, so that's like your Presbyterians, Lutherans, maybe Methodist. They kind of straddle the fence between evangelical and mainline Protestant. Probably depends on the strand of it. But Episcopal, Anglican, they're looking at about a 25-minute sermon. 39 minutes for evangelicals, okay? So they're on the kind of longer end. And then 54 minutes for historically black Protestants. So several pastors face pressure to keep trimming the length of sermons to fit people's minimal attention spans, says Reverend Tim Keller, the longtime evangelical pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. So he was the pastor there. That is a PCA church, not a PCUSA. So they fall more into the evangelical slot than they do the mainline Protestant, even though typically a Presbyterian would be mainline Protestant. Just want to mention that distinction. I'm not an expert on denominations. If I got something wrong, I am sorry. My thing is preaching, not necessarily denomination. So if I talked about your denomination incorrectly, please forgive me. This is a place of grace, isn't it? Anyway, 14 minutes, 25 minutes, 39 minutes, 54 minutes. So I don't think most evangelical pastors, says Tim Keller, are good enough for a 39-minute sermon. Keller said that needs to shorten. This is interesting coming from Tim Keller, who's, by the way, Tim Keller's book, Preaching, Communicating Faith in an Age of Skepticism, is one of my top 5 favorite preaching books. I mean, I think it's just one of the best that's out there. And he is a guy who can keep people's attention for 39 or 49 or 59 or 69 or 79 minutes or however long he wants to speak. He is a phenomenal communicator. He's very gripping, and he's very monotone. He doesn't have any theatrics. He doesn't really move. He's very much just down the line. But his content is amazing, and I think there's something we can learn from that. We can learn from all different types of style. Keller said when he started preaching 40 years ago, regular church attendance meant someone was in the pew 3 out of 4 Sundays. That number has dropped. Now, a regular churchgoer appears maybe 1.75 out of 4 Sundays. He wonders whether that's because many are listening to sermons via podcast or online streaming as fallback to showing up for a service. So this is interesting, and this is something that I'm sure you've experienced at your church. I know we have at our church, that a regular attender, people who consider themselves regular to our church, it's not uncommon for them to come 1 out of 4 Sundays or 2 out of 4 Sundays and consider themselves just a regular part of our church. And we would definitely prefer more than that. We'd definitely prefer 4 out of 4 Sundays, but that's just the way it is. Now, there are lots of people, I'm sure in your church and in mine, who are there 4 out of 4 Sundays. They're typically the more committed. They're kind of, they volunteer. And so it's not everybody, but if you're going to take an average, if you've got, let's say, 1,000 people showing up to your church on Sunday, you probably actually have a church of 15, 16, maybe 1,700 that actually consider themselves regular attenders of your church. And if they were asked, what church do you go to? They would say your church, even though only 1,000 show up on Sunday. because people show up so infrequently, you actually have a much larger church than maybe you think. I just think that's interesting because, as he says, 40 years ago, it was different. Let's go check out New York Times. So this was the article they did on it. How long is the sermon study ranks Christian churches? One of the things that I think is interesting about this, Pew said sermons at the black churches lasted longer than mainline Protestant sermons, even though on average they had roughly the same number of words. A possible explanation, Pew said, is that the preachers at black churches allow more time during their sermons for musical interludes, responses from worshipers in the pews, and dramatic pauses in their oratory. So I think this is just something that we need to make sure we pay attention to, is cultural differences in preaching, that you have some people who might do a very kind of down the line, same cadence throughout, just a set of words, building tension, hopefully creating an outline, taking people on a journey. Where other people, you're going to have a more experiential, they're going to let people kind of feel the moment and be moved by it. And I think that that is one of the things that makes preaching such a unique art and such a dynamic art, is that it really flows through all of who you are as a person. And so for me, I preach in a certain way that fits with my personality. I preach very much like I'm talking to you right now, very much like I talk to someone, talk to a friend. If I tried to be someone I'm not in the pulpit because I thought that's what everybody wants from me, it would be insincere and it would come across as contrived or canned or not me. Do what you do really well. Let it flow through who you are as a person, your experience. Let God kind of do what he does through you as the vessel, and own that. Let's check out one more source. This is the Gospel Coalition, How Sermon Length and Content Differ Across Traditions. So they give a little bit of context into the actual study, which we've already talked about. But then down here, I think this is interesting. So this is Joe Carter, and he answers this question, why it matters. And here's what he says. The results from Pew Research are mainly interesting for comparison across Christian traditions, but the use of such computational analysis of sermons could be beneficial for identifying trends in evangelical preaching. It can also be helpful for clearing up misconceptions about what is being taught in our churches. This is interesting. On any given week, you are likely to hear someone in the pews or on social media make a sweeping assertion that preachers in evangelical churches never talk about X from the pulpit. The claims are almost always made based on anecdotal evidence and often by people who, though they have limited exposure to the preaching in other churches, feel confident reporting on what is not said in churches they've never attended. Having some evidence from which to judge such assertions would be helpful in identifying positive or negative trends in evangelical teaching. So here's what he's saying. In this study, which we did not get into, we might in a later video because I wanted to keep it focused on sermon length. But in this study, they actually analyzed what was said and quantified how many references there were to hell or sin or judgment or fill in the blank. But they kind of categorized that all into how do we fit all these things together based on denomination. And so what he's saying is that people will say, oh, churches today, they just never talk about the blood of Christ. Well, that's not exactly true because this study of 50,000 sermons shows otherwise, okay? Or maybe it doesn't. But my point is, I think he brings up a good point that you don't know until you do the research, which is why I'm glad that there are organizations out there that do research like this. So I just think this is interesting. And I want to ask you again, we talked about this when I talked about sermon length before, but now we have more information. How long do you preach? What is a typical sermon length for you? What denomination are you? Okay, so we've got Preaching Donkey has a lot of people from a lot of different denominations. And so I want to know what's your background and how long do you preach? And how does your denomination differ from this study, okay? Maybe you're a mainline Protestant and you preach for 15 minutes, not 25. Or maybe you're a mainline Protestant and you preach for 45, not 25. I want to know. So let me know in the comments. Be sure to subscribe if you want more content like this on preaching. And I want to offer you, if you haven't got it yet, my free 21-day guide to creating killer sermons. You can pick it up at preachingdonkey.com/21 days. It's my gift to you. You can just go there, and basically what this is, it's a 3-week guide that for your next sermon, if you want something that will really help you just kind of walk through the text and begin to formulate an outline and turn it into a compelling sermon, that is for you to go to preachingdonkey.com/21 days. I'd love to put it in your hands there. We'll see you next time here at Preaching Donkey. As always, remember, if God can speak through a donkey, he can speak through you. We'll see you next time.